There is a particular kind of person who seems immune to defeat, not because they never fail. They fail often, sometimes spectacularly, but because failure never seems to register as a final answer. Where others stop, they continue. Where others accept the verdict of circumstance, they treat that verdict as provisional. What separates these individuals from everyone else is not luck, and it is not talent. It is a distinct psychological architecture, one that can be studied, understood, and, as we will see, deliberately built. To understand persistence, we must first correct a common misconception. Never giving up is not the same as stubbornness. Stubbornness is rigid. It clings to a single path regardless of evidence. Persistence is adaptive. It clings not to the method, but to the outcome, willing to change strategy, direction, and approach as many times as necessary, while refusing to abandon the underlying goal. This distinction matters because it reveals that persistence is not about brute willpower. It is about flexible commitment. The relentless mind is not one that refuses to bend. It is one that refuses to break. At the core of this psychological trait lies a specific relationship with discomfort. Most people experience difficulty as a signal to stop, a biological alarm bell warning them away from pain. But those who never give up have, through repetition or necessity, recalibrated that alarm. Discomfort, for them, becomes informative rather than prohibitive. It is treated as a normal companion of growth, not evidence that growth is impossible. This recalibration does not happen overnight, and it is rarely comfortable to develop. But it explains why the same setback that ends one person's effort barely registers as a pause for another. Equally important is the role of identity. Psychological research consistently shows that people who sustain long-term effort tend to anchor their self-concept to the process of pursuit, not to any single outcome. In other words, they do not define themselves as someone who succeeded or someone who failed. They define themselves as someone who succeeded, or someone who succeeded, or someone who failed. They define themselves as someone who works toward this. This subtle shift changes everything. When identity is tied to outcome, every failure becomes a threat to the self. When identity is tied to process, failure becomes simply a data point. Uncomfortable, perhaps disappointing, but never existentially threatening. The relentless mind protects its sense of self by locating it in effort rather than result. This connects directly to what psychologists call a growth-oriented framework, the belief that abilities and circumstances are not fixed, but developable through sustained effort. Individuals who hold this belief interpret struggle differently than those who see ability as static. A person with a fixed view experiences difficulty as proof of limitation. A person with a growth view experiences the same difficulty as proof that development is still in progress. The external event is identical. The internal interpretation is not, and that interpretation determines whether the next step is taken or abandoned. What emerges from these three elements, adaptive commitment, recalibrated discomfort, and process-based identity, is not a personality quirk. It is a coherent psychological system, one that can be observed, measured, and replicated. This is the encouraging truth hidden inside the mythology of the unstoppable individual. They were not born this way. Their minds were shaped, deliberately or accidentally, by patterns of thought that anyone can learn to adopt. But recognizing that persistence is buildable raises an immediate question, one far more useful than admiration. If this trait can be constructed, what exactly are the mechanisms that build it? What do these individuals actually do, moment to moment, when motivation disappears and the outcome remains uncertain? If persistence is a system rather than a gift, then the real question is mechanical. What do these individuals actually do when the initial spark of motivation has long since burned out? The answer lies not in intensity, but in architecture, the quiet, almost invisible structures they build around their own behavior. The first mechanism is the reclassification of failure. Where most people experience failure as a verdict, the relentless mind treats it as a transmission, a piece of information traveling from the world back to the self. A failed attempt is not read as "you cannot do this." It is read as "this particular method does not work under these particular conditions." This is not positive thinking in the shallow sense. It is precise thinking. The emotional sting is not eliminated, but it is separated from the analytical task of extracting what the failure actually revealed. Over time, this turns every setback into raw material rather than a closed door. The second mechanism is even less glamorous: the abandonment of motivation as a prerequisite for action. Popular culture suggests that persistent people feel a constant burning drive. In reality, motivation is unreliable. It rises and falls with sleep, mood, stress, and circumstance. Those who sustain effort across years, not days, understand this instability and refuse to depend on it. Instead, they construct small, repeatable actions that require no emotional permission to execute. The goal is not to feel ready. The goal is to make the next action so minimal that readiness becomes irrelevant. This is why consistency outperforms intensity. A small action repeated for 1,000 days accumulates further than a burst of passion that lasts 3. The third mechanism concerns emotional regulation in the exact moment doubt appears. Persistent individuals are not immune to frustration, discouragement, or fear of wasted effort. They simply do not treat these emotions as instructions. There is a critical, almost imperceptible gap between feeling discouraged and deciding to stop. And it is inside that gap that the relentless mind operates. They allow the emotion to exist without granting it authority over the next decision. This is less about suppressing feeling and more about refusing to let a temporary internal state dictate a long-term external commitment. Finally, there is the environmental dimension, one frequently underestimated. Persistence is rarely sustained in isolation. The people, feedback, and standards surrounding an individual either reinforce their long-term orientation or quietly erode it. Those who maintain relentless effort tend to curate their surroundings deliberately, seeking environments where continued effort is normalized, where setbacks are discussed rather than hidden, and where identity is not threatened by honest struggle. This is not about surrounding oneself with unconditional positivity. It is about surrounding oneself with realism paired with continued expectation. Taken together, these 4 mechanisms, reframed failure, motivation-independent action, emotional non-compliance, and deliberate environment, do not describe an extraordinary person. They describe an ordinary mind operating under a different set of internal rules. This is the quiet revelation beneath the myth of the unstoppable individual. Their strength was not innate. It was assembled, decision by decision, often in moments no one else witnessed. So the question is no longer whether such a mind is rare. The question is whether you are willing to install these same rules into your own life, to treat your next failure as information instead of judgment, to act before you feel ready, to let discomfort visit without letting it decide, and to build around yourself the conditions where continued effort is simply what is expected. What would change in your life, starting today, if you stopped waiting to feel ready and simply took the next small step anyway?